We're back here at Unpacking TED's Top 10. And today we're going to be looking at Jon Ronson's TED Talk called Strange Answers to the Psychopath Test. Now, at the time that this was being recorded, this is ranked as TED's 9th most watched TED Talk, and it's coming in at about 25.5 million views. So a very well-watched TED Talk. Let's find out why.
The story starts. I was at a friend's house and she had on her shelf a copy of the DSM manual, which is the manual of mental disorders. It lists every known mental disorder. And it used to be back in the 50s a very slim pamphlet, and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's 886 pages long, and it lists currently 374 mental disorders. So I was leafing through it, wondering if I had any mental disorders, and it turns out I've got 12. I've got generalized anxiety disorder, which is a given. I've got nightmare disorder, which is categorized if you have recurrent dreams of being pursued or declared a failure. And all my dreams involve people chasing me down the street going, "You're a failure." I've got parent-child relational problems, which I blame my parents for. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. I'm kidding. And I've got malingering. And I think it's actually quite rare to have both malingering and generalized anxiety disorder, because malingering tends to make me feel very anxious. Anyway, I was looking through this book wondering if I was much crazier than I thought I was, or maybe it's not a good idea to diagnose yourself with a mental disorder if you're not a trained professional, or maybe the psychiatry profession has a kind of strange desire to label what's essentially normal human behavior as a mental disorder. I didn't know which of these things was true, but I thought it was kind of interesting, and I thought maybe I should meet a critic of psychiatry to get their view, which is how I ended up having lunch with the Scientologists.
This TED Talk, there's a lot to unpack here. So firstly, you may have noticed a couple of things. Firstly, he's got quite a production set with him. He's got these visuals that are going on in the background, not just visuals, but also audio effects as well. My opinion on this is that it would actually be made more effective if he had nothing at all. And you'll see why I think this as we continue. Long story short, personally, I think it actually distracts from the core message. Jon is a natural storyteller. He's a journalist by trade, and he is superb at telling stories. To me, this use of visuals and audio feels like a distraction to what it is he actually needs to say. So personally, I think it would have been made better without these additions. Secondly, you would have noticed he started with a story. And actually, this is not just a one story. This forms the beginning part of the story for what is a story that runs over the entire TED Talk. This is such a captivating way to draw your audience in. We are suckers for stories. So a great way to start. The third thing I want to mention is actually a comment on Jon's use of hand gestures. Now, you may have noticed, and I encourage you to keep an eye out throughout the rest of his TED Talk, that he's got his elbows not only pinned to his torso, but he's also got his hands in front of him a little bit like this, which I would call feeding the birds. It looks like he's about to feed the birds outside in the city square. It's not very open. It's not very confident. It lends itself to a slightly anxious persona, body language, whatever you want to call it. So Jon would have been much better off to unglue his elbows and actually gesture out here, not just in front of his body, but actually bring his arms out and bring his hands to the side of his body where he can take up more space. And that would have made for a much more impactful, confident stance and more confident gesturing as well.
It was a man called Brian who runs a crack team of Scientologists who are determined to destroy psychiatry wherever it lies. They're called the CCHR. And I said to him, can you prove to me that psychiatry is a pseudoscience that can't be trusted?
And you'll see why here. I'm just going to jump in here briefly. When I first watched this video, I've only watched it through once, but when I first watched it through, I thought, gosh, have they got the mic on in the main auditorium? Why can I hear all these voices? But then I realized it was actually part of the audio that he was playing for the audience. It just muddies the message. I think it sounds like he's just secondary to what else might be happening in the room. So a real distraction, in my opinion.
And he said, yes, we can prove it to you. And I said, how? And he said, we can introduce you to Tony. And I said, who's Tony? And he said, Tony's in Broadmoor. Now, Broadmoor is Broadmoor Hospital. It used to be known as the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane. It's where they send the serial killers and the people who can't help themselves. And I said to Brian, well, what did Tony do? And he said, hardly anything. He beat someone up or something, and he decided to fake madness to get out of a prison sentence. But he faked it too well, and now he's stuck in Broadmoor, and nobody will believe he's sane. Do you want us to try and get you into Broadmoor to meet Tony? So I said, yes, please. So I got the train to Broadmoor. I began to yawn uncontrollably around Kempton Park, which apparently is what dogs also do when anxious. They yawn uncontrollably. And we got to Broadmoor, and I got taken through gate after gate after gate after gate into the wellness centre, which is where you get to meet the patients. It looks like a giant Hampton Inn. It's all peach and pine and calming colours, and the only bold colours are the reds of the panic buttons. And the patients started drifting in, and they were quite overweight and wearing sweatpants and quite docile looking. And Brian, the Scientologist, whispered to me, they're medicated, which to the Scientologist is like the worst evil in the world, but I'm thinking it's probably a good idea. And then Brian said, here's Tony. And a man was walking in, and he wasn't overweight. He was in very good physical shape, and he wasn't wearing sweatpants. He was wearing a pinstripe suit, and he had his arm outstretched like someone out of The Apprentice. He looked like a man who wanted to wear an outfit that would convince me that he was very sane. And he sat down, and I said, so is it true that you faked your way in here? And he said, yep, absolutely. I beat someone up when I was 17, and I was in prison awaiting trial, and my cellmate said to me, you know what you have to do? Fake madness. Tell him you're mad, you'll get sent to some cushy hospital, nurses will bring you pizzas, you'll have your own PlayStation. So I said, well, how did you do it? He said, well, I asked to see the prison psychiatrist, and I'd just seen a film called Crash, in which people get sexual pleasure from crashing cars into walls. So I said to the psychiatrist, I get sexual pleasure from crashing cars into walls. And I said, what else? He said, oh yeah, I told the psychiatrist that I wanted to watch women as they died because it would make me feel more normal. And I said, where'd you get that from? He said, oh, from a biography of Ted Bundy that they had at the prison library. Anyway, he faked madness too well, he said, and they didn't send him to some cushy hospital. They sent him to Broadmoor. And the minute he got there, he said he took one look at the place, asked to see the psychiatrist, said, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I'm not mentally ill. I said, how long have you been here for? He said, well, if I'd just done my time in prison for the original crime, I'd have got 5 years. I've been in Broadmoor for 12 years.
What a master storyteller. There are a few things to unpack here. What makes a story great in a lot of instances is the ability to transport your audience to the scene that you are describing. One of the most effective ways to do this is by describing the sounds, the sights, the smells, if there are any, and really highlighting what your senses can pick up from that particular scene. You will note that when he first arrived at Broadmoor, he did an excellent job of putting us in the picture. He was describing the pastel walls and the big bright red panic buttons, and the docile patients wearing sweatpants. I mean, boy, what a way to help us imagine what it is he'd just stepped into. Secondly, he uses dialogue over narration. This is another effective storytelling technique. What this involves is, to explain narration first. Narration is telling what someone said or sharing what someone said in the past tense. It's less immersive, it's less urgent, it's less dramatic, and it almost takes us out of the story. Dialogue is where the speaker adopts the voice of the characters in the story. And so we hear what the character said through the voice of the storyteller. If you notice, this entire conversation between him and Tony has all taken place over dialogue. You'll notice he said, and then Tony said, oh, I said to the psychiatrist that I like to watch women die to make me feel more normal. So he said, use the use of I as if he was Tony at that part of the story. So this is a great way to immerse us into the story by adopting Tony's persona. The last thing I want to mention at this point is actually a point on grooming. John is very understated in this. Tony wasn't understated. He was wearing a pinstripe suit. But John, in this instance, as a speaker, is very understated. And that's endearing. He's dressed as he would if he was probably doing the interview at Broadmoor. But for some reason, maybe it's just me, but his cuff on his jacket, which almost appears to be a rain jacket, which to me doesn't seem quite right in this context, is flapping about in the wind as if he needs to do the button up on his cuff. So this is a little irk of mine that I've noticed, and what it's prompted me to do is it's taken me away from what John is actually saying, and I'm now distracted by this cuff that's flapping in the wind. So it is worth thinking twice about what we wear, that we're actually comfortable, but also what we wear is functional and non-distracting. I find the jacket a little on the distracting side. Let's continue.
To convince people you're sane than it is to convince them you're crazy. I thought the best way to seem normal would be to talk to people normally about normal things like football and what's on TV. I subscribed to New Scientist, and recently they had an article about how the US Army was training bumblebees to sniff out explosives. So I said to a nurse, did you know that the US Army is training bumblebees to sniff out explosives? When I read my medical notes, I saw they'd written, believes bees can sniff out explosives. He said, they're always looking out for non-verbal clues to my mental state, but how do you sit in a sane way? How do you cross your legs in a sane way? It's just impossible. When Tony said that to me, I thought to myself, am I sitting like a journalist? Am I crossing my legs like a journalist? He said, I've got the Stockwell Strangler on one side of me, and I've got the Tiptoe Through the Tulips rapist on the other side of me. So I tend to stay in my room a lot because I find them quite frightening. And they take that as a sign of madness. They say it proves that I'm aloof and grandiose. So only in Broadmoor would not wanting to hang out with serial killers be a sign of madness. Anyway, he seemed completely normal to me, but what did I know? And when I got home, I emailed his clinician, Anthony Maiden. I said, what's the story? And he said, yep, we accept that Tony faked madness to get out of a prison sentence because his hallucinations that had seemed quite cliche to begin with just vanished the minute he got to Broadmoor. However, we have assessed him and we've determined that what he is a psychopath. And in fact, faking madness is exactly the kind of cunning and manipulative act of a psychopath. It's on the checklist, cunning, manipulative. So faking your brain going wrong is evidence that your brain has gone wrong. And I spoke to other experts, and they said the pinstripe suit, classic psychopath, speaks to items 1 and 2 on the checklist: glibness, superficial charm, and grandiose sense of self-worth. I said, I want to hang out with the other patients. Classic psychopath, it speaks to grandiosity and also lack of empathy. So all the things that had seemed most normal about Tony was evidence, according to his clinician, that he was mad in this new way. He was a psychopath. And his clinician said to me, if you want to know more about psychopaths, you can go on a psychopath spotting course run by Robert Hare, who invented the psychopath checklist. So I did. I went on a psychopath spotting course, and I am now a certified, and I have to say extremely adept, psychopath spotter. So here's the statistics. 1 in 100 regular people is a psychopath. So there's 1,500 people in this room. 15 of you are psychopaths. Although that figure rises to 4% of CEOs and business leaders. So I think there's a very good chance there's about 30 or 40 psychopaths in this room. It could be carnage by the end of the night. Hare said the reason why is because capitalism at its most ruthless rewards psychopathic behavior, the lack of empathy, the glibness, cunning, manipulative. In fact, capitalism, perhaps at its most remorseless, is a physical manifestation of psychopathy. It's like a form of psychopathy that's come down to affect us all. And Hare said to me, you know what, forget about some guy at Broadmoor who may or may not have fake madness. Who cares? That's not a big story. The big story, he said, is corporate psychopathy. You want to go and interview yourself some corporate psychopaths? So I gave it a try. I wrote to the Enron people. I said, can I come and interview you in prison to find out if you're psychopaths? They didn't reply. So I changed tack. I emailed Chainsaw Al Dunlap, the asset stripper from the 1990s. He would come into failing businesses and close down 30% of the workforce, just turn American towns into ghost towns. And
you may have noticed that John's gestures have started to loosen up a bit. Now, this is typical. People tend to start more anxious and therefore their hands are more constricted. But as he started to get into it and actually started to enjoy himself, we're seeing him bring in these bigger gestures. At one point, he had his hands up above his head and was bringing them down in a kind of triangle formation. He was throwing his hands about to emphasize, which is just fantastic. The challenge is, as speakers, how do we bring these big gestures in and start them from the outset, even if we don't feel confident? There's no magic formula here, but if you can somehow warm up your hands so that it does feel more natural to present with bigger hands at the outset, you're going to be better off. One way you could do this is by going into a toilet cubicle and just loosening up a little bit and shaking out and using those hands so that when you come on stage, they naturally fall a little bit more bigger than you would have otherwise started. So it's great to see John using more hands as he's continuing. However, his default gesture still comes back to feeding the birds, which in my opinion is quite distracting.
I believe you may have a very special brain anomaly that makes you special, interested in the predatory spirit and fearless. Can I come and interview you about your special brain anomaly? And he said, come on over. So I went to our Dunlap's grand Florida mansion that was filled with sculptures of predatory animals. There were lions and tigers. He was taking me to the garden. There were falcons and eagles. He was saying to me over there, you've got sharks and more. He was saying this in a less effeminate way. You've got more sharks and you've got tigers. It was like Narnia. And then we went into his kitchen. Now, our Dunlap would be brought in to save failing companies. He'd close down 30% of the workforce, and he'd quite often fire people with a joke. Like, for instance, one famous story about him, somebody came up to him and said, I've just bought myself a new car. And he said, well, you may have a new car, but I'll tell you what you don't have, a job. So in his kitchen, he was standing there with his wife, Judy, and his bodyguard, Sean. And I said, you know how I said in my email that you might have a special brain anomaly that makes you special. And he said, yeah, it's an amazing theory. It's like Star Trek. You're going where no man has gone before. And I said, well, some psychologists might say that this makes you... And he said, what? And I said, a psychopath. And I said, I've got a list of psychopathic traits in my pocket. Can I go through them with you? And he looked intrigued despite himself, and he said, okay, go on. And I said, okay, grandiose sense of self-worth, which I have to say would have been hard for him to deny because he was standing underneath a giant oil painting of himself. He said, well, you've got to believe in you. And I said, manipulative. He said, that's leadership. And I said, shallow affect and inability to experience a range of emotions. He said, who wants to be weighed down by some nonsense emotions? So he was going down the psychopath checklist, basically turning it into who moved my cheese.
If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have two voices, and in this case, John's got his voice and he's got the other character's voice, one thing that you can do to make it obvious who is speaking at any one point is to shift your body directionally for each character. So person A, you might direct all the dialogue in this direction, and when you're speaking as person B, you shift slightly and speak in this direction. This just clears up any ambiguity over who's saying what. This is a really effective technique to use, and it's not over the top either. It's a subtle movement as you go from A to B. The other thing that I think would have improved this and made it even more funny is, well, if we first look at what he's doing, John's presenting a list, and it's quite a long list, and it's becoming increasingly obvious as he goes through the checklist that this gentleman is, in fact, a psychopath. He could have sped up the list partway through to create the sense of momentum and urgency and build the tension to then land on the fact that he obviously is, in John's opinion, a psychopath. Pace in speaking is a really effective way of playing with urgency and tension. When we slow down, we're relaxed, we're in control, we're calm. But when we speed up, we create tension and urgency in what it is we're saying.
But I did notice something happening to me the day I was without Dunlap. Whenever he said anything to me that was kind of normal, like he said no to juvenile delinquency, he said he got accepted into West Point and they don't let delinquents in West Point. He said no to many short-term marital relationships. He's only ever been married twice. Admittedly, his first wife cited in her divorce papers that he once threatened her with a knife and said he always wondered what human flesh tasted like. But people say stupid things to each other in bad marriages in the heat of an argument. And his second marriage has lasted 41 years. So whenever he said anything to me that just seemed kind of non-psychopathic, I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to put that in my book. And then I realized that becoming a psychopath spotter had kind of turned me a little bit psychopathic. So I was desperate to shove him in a box marked psychopath. I was desperate to define him by his maddest edges. And I realized, oh my God, this is what I've been doing for 20 years. It's what all journalists do. We travel across the world with our notepads in our hands and we wait for the gems. And the gems are always the outermost aspects of our interviewee's personality. And we stitch them together like medieval monks and we leave the normal stuff on the floor. And this is a country that overdiagnoses certain mental disorders hugely. Childhood bipolar, children as young as 4 are being labelled bipolar because they have temper tantrums, which scores them high on the bipolar checklist. When I got back to London, Tony phoned me. He said, why haven't you been returning my calls? I said, well, they say that you're a psychopath. And he said, I'm not a psychopath. He said, you know what? One of the items on the checklist is lack of remorse. But another item on the checklist is cunning manipulative. So when you say you feel remorse for your crime, they say, typical of the psychopath, to cunningly say he feels remorse when he doesn't. It's like witchcraft. They turn everything upside down. He said, I've got a tribunal coming up. Will you come to it? So I said, okay. So I went to his tribunal. And after 14 years in Broadmoor, they let him go. They decided that he shouldn't be held indefinitely because he scores high on a checklist that might mean that he has a greater than average chance of recidivism. So they let him go.
Interesting use of inflection here. And when I say inflection, I mean the upward and downward lift of the voice. You'll notice he used the phrase, they let him go, twice. And in both cases, his voice lifts at the end of that statement. They let him go. When we think about the gravity of this phrase or the significance of it, pairing that with an upward lilt of the voice at the end of the sentence, I think distracts from, or detracts, I should say, from the significance of what it is he's saying. If you're ever wanting to come across as powerful or emphasize something, it's often worth tapering your sentences off at the end. And even better if you can pair this with a pause. Imagine if he'd said it like this. And after 14 years of being in prison, they let him go. Versus they let him go, which makes it sound quite flippant. But this is a big deal here. They let him go. So I think just be mindful of that inflection and the meaning behind certain phrases when you use either upward or downward inflection.
Everyone's a bit psychopathic. He said, you are, I am. Well, obviously I am. I said, what are you going to do now? He said, I'm going to go to Belgium because there's a woman there that I fancy, but she's married, so I'm going to have to get a split up from her husband. Anyway, that was 2 years ago, and that's where my book ended. And for the last 20 months, everything was fine. Nothing bad happened. He was living with a girl outside London. He was, according to Brian the Scientologist, making up for lost time, which I know sounds ominous, but isn't necessarily ominous. Unfortunately, after 20 months, he did go back to jail for a month. He got into a fracas in a bar, he called it. Ended up going to jail for a month, which I know is bad, but at least a month implies that it's whatever the fracas was, wasn't too bad. And then he phoned me. And you know what? I think it's right that Tony is out, because you shouldn't define people by their maddest edges. And what Tony is he's a semi-psychopath. He's a grey area in a world that doesn't like grey areas. But the grey areas are where you find the complexity, and it's where you find the humanity, and it's where you find the truth. And Tony said to me, John, can I buy you a drink in a bar? I just want to thank you for everything you've done for me. And I didn't go. What would you have done? Thank you.
Oh, such an opportunity for impact at the end. Missed opportunity. Did you guess what he could have done to make that more impactful? He was missing a big fat pause. Let's replay that. And I just want you to note what a pause could have done when he said the words, and he invited me for a drink, and I didn't go. But notice how he runs those sentences together. Let's try that again.
Hey, John, can I buy you a drink in a bar? I just want to thank you for everything you've done for me. And I didn't go. What would you have done? Thank you.
And even again then, pause, what would you have done? John, I want to invite you for a drink in a bar. Will you come? I didn't go. What would have you done? By pausing between those statements, it would have really allowed us to let the gravity of the situation sink in, and we would have internalized what we would have done in that situation. But in this case, we didn't really get a chance to it because he just ran on and then left the stage. Particularly towards the end, pause is a great way of adding impact, but also indicating to your audience that you're reaching the end of the presentation. Interestingly, another comment just to draw your attention again to the production side of John's talk, which is absolutely impressive. Right towards the end there, the volume of the background music against John's voice seemed out of balance. So I could hear more of the music, or so it felt that way, over John's voice. It just didn't work for me. And I keep coming back to the fact that even though it is impressive, there's a lot going on there, sound effects, visuals, I don't think it adds much to it. He did such a good job of his descriptions. He told the story through his use of language that I just don't feel like those visuals and that audio actually added all that much. And for me personally, it actually distracted from it. Less is more, folks. You can ask yourself, will this actively enhance my presentation, or is this actually just a distraction? So what's the summary of John's talk, Strange Answers to the Psychopath Test? Well, first, let's look at structure. Very organic. The entire presentation was this long story that worked really effectively. We were captivated from beginning to end, absolutely. Because the story had lots of different sections in it, from his time at the beginning discovering the manual of different mental disorders, to visiting Broadmoor, to going to the house of that gentleman with all the wild animals. There are different chapters within this overall story. The use of pause would have helped us be able to distinguish from one section to the next. So I do think John could have brought in more pause to help mark the different sections of his presentation, enabling allowing for a more clear structure. Secondly, on the delivery front, great use of character voices. He really got into his gestures in the end. He warmed up, but still feeding the birds, I personally found that distracting. And even right towards the end, I noticed he'd even started to pick at a certain finger. We want to cut out those mannerisms. I think it was Dale Carnegie that said, there are no neutral gestures. Any gesture that doesn't add to a presentation distracts from it. And personally, I found certain gestures of John reasonably distracting. And lastly, audience appeal. Well, you can't really go wrong here. He did a fantastic job of incorporating a long, captivating story and used excellent storytelling techniques like dialogue over narration, like descriptions using drawing upon the 5 senses to really put his audience in the picture. And at the end of the day, I think that is what makes this such an impactful presentation.